rights in law and in practice. And as we said in the very first free school, there is a difference, right? Because you can implement as much as you like through the law, and you might still have society doing a very different thing. So we always say in law and in practice when we talk about any kind of law or justice work and any kind of human rights issue. Okay, so we go to the next slide. One of the things that I don't think we've actually shown this slide during the free school series, but we use this in every single SOGIESC session that we teach. And the reason why we do that is human rights law didn't just come about magically that, you know, everybody just decided that these are the human rights, you know, that we're all entitled to. After we came as a world through the First and the Second World War, the Second World War particularly, people said, oh my gosh, we can never do this again. You know, the amount of horror, we all know what happened during World War II. And just as in any conflict and war, there were those who gained privilege and those who didn't gain privilege through those world wars, right? You have the winners and the losers. That is the nature of conflict and war. And as people came out the other side and nation states were reconfigured, you know, there were certain groupings that were reconfigured after the Second World War in the 1940s, that then the world agreed, and it was the world powers, but all of the nation states of the world, there's 194 of them, I think, right now. And there's been a split in Sudan, so that's changed the numbers as well. And there are observers as well within the United Nations, like Palestine, the Holy See, which many like me are not clear on why they even have a seat as an observer at the United Nations. But that these are all part of how we negotiate agreements as nation states around the world. Okay, and then into that system comes the idea that everybody should be able to say together as human beings, these are the human rights that no one can take away, that everyone has and that no one can take away as humans. That human rights system is then codified within the Universal Declaration on Human Rights. That then is further codified into various other conventions and treaties. And then we start to see all of these special recommendations. States sign on to all of those conventions, and they agree that these are the things that they will hold firm to no matter what happens. Now, we all know as humans that when governments say that, they say one thing and then they can often do the other. But we still have all of these human rights set there, and we have those conventions and treaties that frame them for us, that help to make them real. Okay, next slide. So what can we say about human rights? Next slide, thanks. Yeah. What we can say is that human rights are inherent to all human beings. This is what we've said in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Whatever our nationality, place of residence, our sex, our color, our religion, our language, and that language in there, in the Universal Declaration, is very important, or any other status, right? So some things that were written down in 1940s, they hadn't yet thought about yet. For instance, climate change. For instance, SOGIESC. So there are many issues that are further codified as time goes on, but they are there in the spirit of the Human Rights Declaration, right? We are all equally entitled to our human rights without discrimination, and that there are certain things we say about those human rights. One is that they are interrelated, that they depend on each other. You know, if one pillar falls away, one leg goes kaput, then all of the legs go kaput. Right? So interdependent, and they are indivisible. They are part of one thing, right? And the last bit is really important, which is inalienable. You can't take them away. So for instance, if you are a prisoner of war, you are still supposed to be able to rely on your human rights. And that's even codified into various treaties, including the Treaty on Torture. You know, there's many ways that we then say, okay, how would that actually work? If you had, if you are a person like this, what would your rights have to look like? That's why we have things like the Commission on Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. We call it CEDAW, Convention on the Elimination of All Forms of Discrimination Against Women. How might that help, for instance, lesbians? How might it help LGBTQI people? How might it relate to transgender women? Those things are all issues that we have to think about. If human rights are for everyone, then every time we talk about it, we have to think about the issue of SOGIESC. We have to think about the issue of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And we have to say, is it true? Does it actually work that way? Or is it only certain women that can access these systems and certain others don't get the chance? What about poor women, for instance? What about women who are living in maritime areas of the Pacific? Do they get to access some of these mechanisms that we say, for instance, in this case, are for all women? Or what about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights for all genders? Does it really apply? How does it apply? So that's how we start to make it real. Okay, the next one. If you look at Article 7, next slide. If you look at the next article, which is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, all are equal before the law and are entitled without any discrimination to equal protection of the law. Imagine, that's a huge statement. And how do you then take that global norm, that international law, this is international law, right? How do you take that international law and make it regional and then national and then local and then individual? Wow, that's a big task. And that's part of the work, is us pushing states and asking this question all the time. How is it happening? Is it happening? How are you doing that? Because you signed on to this. What does that then require you to do? If the state is the duty bearer, the holder of these human rights, then they need to be made accountable to that, obviously. And how come, if they're so accountable to that, how come so many women face violence? If they're so accountable to that, how come so many people face discrimination on the basis of SOGIESC? So many questions, right? How come so many people are poor? Okay, SOGIESC advancement in the UN system. I'm not even going to go through this really, the next three. Tamani will just very quickly, like 2 seconds on each slide, because what I more wanted to do was to show you this work has been ongoing all the way back, even further than 2011. To even get it on the table at 2011, the 2 first official reports we ever saw, that took years of work prior. Keep going forward. If you look at, keep going forward. Next one. To even get this is called the Yogyakarta Principles. The Yogyakarta Principles are basically a tool that social movements around the world who work on SOGIESC are using to make sure that we can make the connection between universal human rights and SOGIESC. So it's making it clear that this is not any kind of special rights or new rights. All of these things that are talked about in the international human rights law, they all apply to people with all kinds of sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and sex characteristics. So they've done this in a tool, and that tool is online. Please look up the Yogyakarta Principles, but even more important, look up the workbook. There is an action book. If you look at the Constitution of the Republic of Fiji, the 2013 Constitution, right? There are specific provisions about sexual orientation and gender identity and expression. We don't have sex characteristics yet in the Constitution. We have SOGIE, SOGIE. But if you look at the constitutions around the world, that's a wonderful achievement. And it is an achievement of activists working with lawyers, working with government reps and others to make sure that that was in the Constitution from 2013. So look at the next slide. One of the things in Fiji that we call on all the time, and you also can make reference to it in your activism around the Pacific, is Article 26 in the Fiji Bill of Rights. This is in the Fiji Constitution. This is the highest law of the land. All other laws devolve from the Fiji Constitution, right? So under Article 26 in the Bill of Rights, we have the right to equality and freedom from discrimination. So under Article 26, there are three provisions, three sets of provisions. The first is that every person is equal before the law. The second is that equality includes full and equal enjoyment of rights. And there are certain ways that this is precluded. So for instance, in Fiji, there is no same-sex marriage. In Fiji, there is no adoption under the law at the moment on adopting children as a couple. You can still adopt as a single person. There are other ways that you can, you can push forward the rights, but we are still on our journey of full and equal enjoyment of rights. So that's 1 and 2. The next. Okay, we have the right to equality and freedom from discrimination. And it says specifically that a person must not be unfairly discriminated against directly or indirectly on the grounds of, and then you see there's a whole set of things. And I've just pulled out the things that we are talking about today, but there's many, many more, right? So you can see sex, gender. So you can say actually that relates to sex characteristics. You can do the work of sex characteristics under the first one, sex. Then gender, sexual orientation, gender identity and expression, and then you have all the other intersectional categories, including health status, disability, age, religion, etc. So all of these things are already encoded in our highest law of the land. And then you say, Noelene, all very well and good. Does that mean that all LGBTQI people are free and equal now in Fiji? No, of course it doesn't. So the next slide. There is almost no drawdown from the Constitution. We've removed some of the issues, like for instance, there has been challenges on the issue of precedence on issues like privacy, on issues of anti-discrimination, gender identity and identity papers. There's many, many issues that have been challenged through the years, but not enough, because what we find ourselves trying to do is to kind of do it. What we need is a mapping across all of the laws, all of the policies, so that we can say on all of these areas, we require this to be shifted, so that we can say we are truly in line with the Constitution, right? So that's what we can say, is that things are changing, but not fast enough. LGBTQI plus people are still facing violations. We've had transgender people who have been killed. Lots of people of all sexual orientations, gender identities and expressions who face violence. In our 2019 research, which has already been shared in the chat, we have higher rates of violence against LGBTQ people in Fiji than we do of women. And those rates are already double the global average, between 60 to 70%. And the rates for the national survey we did was 84%, say that they have had faced violence on the issue of their SOGIESC, right? So we already know that LGBTQI people are facing violations in Fiji, but we also know it across all the Pacific Island states and territories, as across the world. Next.